Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of August 9th, 2021. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin, and happy to be joined again today by Josh Blank, Research and Polling Director for the Texas Politics Project, located here in Austin, but in a different location, correct?
Oh, that's true. Yes, but very close.
But very close, yes.
in a bunker from Austin, is that?
Yes, we are in our respective bunkers, banished by the resurgent Delta variant. Actually, I don't think we ever really left the bunkers very much, even
really.
during the pleasant interview.
I stuck my head out, but it was full of COVID out there, and now I'm back.
Yanked it back in. So, Josh, we spent the podcast last week talking about the resurgence of the coronavirus as the Delta variant spread, and in the end, the conversation, was very much about how shot through with politics the response was, and we ultimately wanted to put off discussion of the legislature to this week, but I think ultimately the situation with the Delta variant has continued to worsen and to become, even more intensely political, which is saying something given how much we dwelled last week on the politics of the situation, right? I mean, a lot's happened since last week though, right?
Yeah, I mean, yes, that's correct. I think the one thing, at least here where we are, as you already brought up, we're in Austin. Austin's in Travis County, Texas, and it doesn't really matter right now, for the most part, what county you're in. The COVID is resurgent, but at least, here over the weekend, we got warnings, in no uncertain terms from Travis County that the situation here is quote unquote dire. That was the word that they used, and basically asking people to, really make a lot more efforts to sort of avoid spreading the virus, whether by, wearing masks, not going places, not having gatherings. I mean, essentially, the message from the county, and I think this is true in a lot of places in Texas, is that this is basically as bad as it's ever been. And I think there's sort of something that's shooting through this that I feel like, it's kind of obvious, but we kind of forget it was, as you said, this discussion has become so political. There's just a brass tacks factual thing about this that we've kind of sort of set aside. It's coming back to vogue here, which is like our hospitals only have so much capacity.
Yeah.
And that was the thing at the beginning of the virus. People were talking about, is the virus, is it going to kill people? How many people is going to kill? And, a lot of, I think, smart people raised their hand and said, hey, look, it might not kill a lot of people. It may not, depends on what we do. But a lot of our smart people said, but like our hospital system can't handle this inflow of people. And that's kind of been what the focus has sort of turned to, I think, in the last maybe like 5 to 7 days, is about, watching hospital capacity shrink and shrink and shrink. And that's something I think is,
not to be crass, but whether people are dying or they're just very sick and requiring care, hospital capacity is an important tripwire here.
Yeah, well, I think the thing is, what's happening is that, we talk about the politics. I mean, the politics are abstract, right? I mean, we're talking about applying principles of freedom and liberty and stuff to sort of individual, behaviors that in America feel very individual in our own right. And that's all fine when we're, and again, when people are taking vaccines and it's hot vax summer and it's like, is it safe to do this or not? It's another thing when, like, your father is putting off his surgery now because we're not having elective surgeries, right? Or, we're talking about the fact that there are no ICU beds available in this many hospitals in your region, right? Or, and I think the other thing that's going to come up, we'll talk about this probably in a little bit, or that we're about to send kids back to school and, we don't have a handle on this. And so I think that sort of makes it a little bit more salient. I think all that makes it, significantly more salient for people, not to mention just the general thing was, even if you are just thinking about like, what is it safe or unsafe to do? And I mean, you and I have talked about this. There's a certain disappointment at this point that, we had this brief window to start imagining a better future. And now it feels like we're backsliding. And I think that's, causing a lot of consternation out there for a lot of people.
Yeah. And I don't want to slide too immediately into the frustration with the level of public discourse about this, because we'll get to it inevitably. But the objective counts, such as we had right now, are all still pretty negative. I mean, a week ago, we were talking about, the steep slope of increases in the 7-day average of new cases, both new confirmed cases, new probable cases, the two measures we get from the state. And those have continued to rise, to my eye, pretty unabated through yesterday, allowing for, we talk about 7-day averages because there's always a lull and a kind of a lag in reporting over weekends.
That's just more accurate. I mean,
Yeah,
averages are better than single
Right.
measures. Social science tip of the day.
And frankly, when we talked last time, the number of deaths had not started to rise. And in fact, there's a lag in reporting of deaths. That too has started to rise in the increase. Now, also, I guess in the interim, local authorities have begun defying, the orders from Governor Abbott that we talked about a lot last week, that prohibited local political authorities like cities, counties, school boards from instituting mask requirements. And a lot has happened here just in the last 24 hours, right? The last day, in which, two of the larger school districts in the state, Austin and Dallas ISDs, have both effectively defied the governor's orders and voted to institute some degree of mask requirements for students in public schools.
And it looks like Harris County is probably going to do so pretty soon.
Everyone, I think, the general expectation is that Harris County will follow. And then there have been lawsuits by nonprofits, and as of this morning, San Antonio Independent School District, looking for relief. In a way, this is getting ahead of, I think, an attempt by the governor to strike back in some way, with Florida looming out there, which we can talk about in a minute. Suing, filing in court for relief from any retaliation from the governor, and defending their own position. And I, just as and I mentioned, I think some of the defensiveness there is that there are school districts that were doing this, beginning to implement this in Florida, in defiance of a very similar order by the Republican governor there, Ron DeSantis. And the governor has pushed back in all kinds of ways, threatening to fine superintendents, providing money for, kids in districts that do this to go get vouchers to go to private schools, which is like perhaps the most unlikely return of the voucher idea.
Right.
It's a very minor note given the scale of things going on, but I want to flag that. The return of vouchers,
right.
Who'd have thunk it? And all this is happening as Texas has become very prominent in national coverage of the COVID surge.
Right. I think I saw that, Texas and Florida basically account for about a third of all the new COVID cases that we've been recording over this most recent surge.
Right. Yeah. Part of that is going to be population, but it certainly, but also certainly suggests that.
Well, and you say part of that's population. It's still a lot of people.
It's still a lot of people, and it's still bigger than they do not constitute a third of the population in the United States.
Right.
But, to be at least nominally fair there. But, and I think the national coverage of this, unfortunately just inevitably gets us back to the politics. But first, we are talking about the schools. You have, somebody, you're a father. I'm wondering what you have to share about like how this unfolded in Austin ISD.
Well, I mean, I have to say, Austin ISD is probably not a representative school district of the state as a whole, as you can imagine, although I'm sure it's a lot more like, Dallas ISD and probably like, I think it's Houston ISD actually, right? It's HISD. I don't think it's Harris County. But, you can kind of see, I think what I've been super focused on generally around a lot of this is the nature of the various political communications. Again, you and I work at UT. I've got a child in AISD, and watching these different organizations try to manage the uncertainty of this situation has been, it's been hard to watch. And it's not even, again, I'm a very, I look at this and I think, boy, this is hard. You look at these sorts of emails and I always think, what is the thing that you would bold in this communicative email so that people know this is the thing if you read nothing else? And it's hard not to look at the communications that you're getting these. And I think a lot of people are getting communications like this, whether parents, employers, whatever, from employers, whoever. And you're like, boy, you could bold about 7 things in here because it's just so unclear. And so AISD went from basically saying, hey, they did a pulse survey and they sort of said, are you planning to wear masks? And I think 80% district-wide of parents said they were going to send their children to school with masks. And then basically sent out kind of an email over the weekend saying, hey, look, we know this is looking bad. We're doing our best. We've got some restrictions. And then rumblings started happening around Monday that, well, maybe we're just going to do this. And I think what probably gave the school districts a little bit of a push, I think, was actually some of the actions of like in Harris County when Sylvester Turner was going to require employees to wear masks. When you started to, I think, see that pushback from some of the big counties in various parts, I think that gave a little bit more courage to some of the school districts to say, is the governor really going to go out and basically die on a hill where he says, no, I'm going to force kids to go to school as they are required to do, and I'm going to force them to do so without allowing the schools to keep them safe. Ultimately, and to me, that's kind of, again, that's sort of a stylized version, but it is a reflection of the fact that this conversation is really politically kind of getting away from the governor. I would like to say a little bit, but I really mean a lot.
Yeah. I want to get to that. And I think, this is a good place to insert that, there is an emergency, Governor Abbott's prohibition on the local authorities from having the option of requiring masks, was based on, the power that he derives from, the emergency powers provisions in statute, and the emerging counter argument that we've heard from a few places. I think most publicly anyway, from a state rep but not running for reelection, John Turner from the North Texas area, is that the governor simply overstepped the statute on emergency powers in his executive order. That executive order is about a response to an emergency, not about limiting the response of local entities to emergencies. And, Representative Turner, we both know, is, smart guy and gets in front of, the counter argument in that piece in the Dallas Morning News.
And he's not, he's not the only one making that argument.
Yes, his powers have been upheld previously in response to challenges to his emergency powers that frankly came from the right, as I recall. Right. But this is not really a response. This is limiting the response of other political entities, and so it's at least arguable.
Well, the thing is, it's arguable, but it's very hard to argue. The logic that is laid out is pretty clear, which is, the Disaster Declaration Act of 1975, I think is what it's called, right? Basically gives the governor the power to declare a disaster and then therefore suspend local laws if that is what he needs to do so as to address the disaster. Right. The idea then that he would declare a disaster to then prohibit local entities from addressing the disaster is pretty, I wouldn't even say it's tortured logic. It doesn't pass a very logic or ends means kind of test. And my guess is that, most of the legal counsel for the cities, the legal counsel for the ISDs are probably kind of coming to similar conclusions here, because I think, and look, what the superintendent of the Austin Independent School District said is look, I can't have one kid die because I didn't do what I think I should do.
Yeah.
And again, setting aside statute, everything else, that's kind of where this political argument is going. If the governor really wants to keep pushing this idea that, we're just basically going to keep living life as if this isn't happening. And
you mentioned, the politics of this being abstract. You've said that a couple of times in conversation, and there's something, and the thing is, some of the politics are very abstract. Right?
Well, the politics,
the justification, of personal liberty in that is pretty abstract.
Well, that's the thing. The politics that he's relying on here, again, we'll come back to this, basically because of where the criticism is coming from, which is the criticism that Abbott's receiving. And I'll just put this out here as a bracket. Absent a Democratic challenger for governor is coming mostly from the right. And the argument is that Abbott has gone too far in suspending Texans' liberties. And, he's made very clear that he's not going to do that again. Now, look, one thing that we talk about on this podcast, and, I'll mention again, is, when you talk about public opinion on any issue and then you bring children into it, it's two different issues.
Yeah.
It's not the same thing. And so this sort of abstract idea of, my freedom not to wear a mask, or not to be forced to wear a mask somewhere is all well and good, except for the fact that it really doesn't hold up when you talk about the practicality of, basically kids who are compulsed to go to school, many of whom are ineligible to be vaccinated, right? And are already required actually to be vaccinated for multiple things and can be told what to wear and not to wear, basically all for the safety and educational environment of the children. So this is like a place in which we accept the fact that kids don't have these rights.
Right. And while there may not be FDA, and while, a drug that doesn't have final FDA approval
Sure.
is almost certainly a bridge too far. It really is hard to make the argument that wearing a mask is somehow materially different from, not being able to wear a t-shirt with obscenities or
Yeah.
a dress skirt length or, whatever, all these kinds of things.
Or whatever, or a hairstyle that they used to have.
That happen in schools all the time. So,
well, and just real quick, on that, and we have questions we've asked throughout the pandemic for the last over a year about people's adherence to social distancing measures. And for the most part, at the height of the pandemic, I would say when we were in a stage 5 situation, like, for example, like we are now, we were seeing upwards of 80% of Republicans saying that they were wearing a mask when they left their house. And it was more about 90 to 95% of Democrats. But ultimately, this idea that there is, an unwillingness even amongst, some partisans, to not wear masks is frankly stupid. And then further, we don't have, again, there are a lot of partisan differences. They aren't biological. We all have noses. We all have mouths. Nobody likes wearing a mask. Ultimately, it's not as though somebody is like, it's not as though some group of people, it's just naturally worse than for other people. Nobody likes this, but we've clearly accepted that this is part of it. It's worse if you wear
glasses.
It is. Okay, we both work. That is true. But anyway, this is just to say it's taking this abstract principle and it's leading to policy that, again, it's like, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And again, I wouldn't want to be in a position where I was trying to argue that this is somehow good for children.
Yeah. And I think that this is another area where the ambient media coverage is not helping, the folks, Team Abbott, frankly, let's just call it that. When the news is full of, children's hospitals also reaching capacity, increased rates among children. And you can talk about what the chances are that the numbers are relatively small, but it's, we were talking about this earlier when what you're really doing is banking on the trade-offs here.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the day, those who are, willing to really, go to the wall on saying you shouldn't have to wear a mask and you shouldn't have to engage in public health measures if you don't want to, which is really what the end of the argument ultimately is, are trading off, from an authority perspective and saying, rather than provide a public health example, I'm going to take that path. And I'm willing to accept the fact that there's going to be an increase in public harm and there's going to be a public health cost for this. But that cost gets higher when you're talking about kids. And that's a very bloodless way of thinking about it. But
well, and the thing is, I would say I almost wish it were that bloodless, right? Because in some ways, if you were to just say, hey, look, there's trade-offs to these things and so be it, that would be one thing. But to some extent, the pandering to, the minority of people who, one, don't think COVID is a serious problem, despite the fact that our hospitals are almost at capacity, and we've had, more than 50,000 people in Texas die. Right. And that, the idea that, having to basically, be slightly uncomfortable sometimes for the, basically so as to keep our health system from collapsing and more Texans from dying is somehow, it's like, and the idea of pandering to this is that this is a perfectly justifiable or rational point of view, given where we are, it emboldens people, and it, I said, there are very few Democrats right now who are sort of going to the left and say, hey, you guys who are totally locked up in your house and who aren't going anywhere and never plan to again, good move.
Yeah.
That's right. It's almost the equivalent, except there are more people on the right who are sort of in this space of, trying to weigh personal liberty against public health. And it's just... Well, and
this gets us into, again, something that's abstract but has a very, liberty for what? Right. Liberty to not be uncomfortable?
Yeah, that's
liberty
what we're
to make other
about.
people, and because of that, to make other people pay for your principled position. We've really lost sight of something here, and it makes me sound like an old guy, but the most abstract thing is actually the scariest, which is that because of our inability to just simply do some basic social distancing measures and, vaccinate at higher rates, that we're giving the virus the time and the space to potentially mutate it again in a way that we're really going to regret in a terrible way. Right.
And look, it doesn't mean it's going to happen, but we're providing it multiple opportunities to. And and this isn't like, this isn't climate change. This isn't some talking about abstract things. I mean, I think of climate change as like the ultimate kind of abstract issue because it's this, it's science and it's worldwide and we all have to, blah, blah, blah. This isn't nearly as abstract. You can look at the numbers in your community. You can look at what the hospital numbers are, like wherever you live, and it's right there.
If we had enough listeners to get mail, we'd get mail on that. But I do want to flag, there was also other news this week.
Oh, that's right.
In a week of very bad news about climate change, which is suggesting that has gotten much more immediate and much less abstract. But I think the point is well taken. So, in terms of the politics of this in an awkward transition to the legislature for the last few minutes, if you take the resurgence of the pandemic and the way that is crowding a lot of things out on the public agenda right now, and you combine that with, what is, an ugly and intractable situation right now, seemingly in the legislature, in which, since the last time we met for the podcast, Greg Abbott called the legislature back into special session for a second time. So they gavelled out the first special session on Friday, convened for the second special session on Saturday. Though there was some speculation that the agenda might get reduced, this wasn't the case. And in fact, in the governor's call for the special session, for the second special session, he actually expanded the agenda, added another, there were some sub-points there, and, you could quibble, but, somewhere between 6 and 9 new items, depending on how you count them. Everybody was saying 7, and, I think that was just the top bullet point. The Senate, again, is moving legislation. As of Tuesday, the House had yet to achieve the necessary 2/3 quorum, mainly as a result of still not attending Democrats, though some Democrats have come back. So,
and a few Republicans weren't there too, and a few Republicans weren't around too.
that including at least one who's been quarantined for COVID, who missed the first day but came back. And that's, not to be coy, that's State Rep Travis Clardy, who was a guest on the podcast a month or so ago, and he's doing fine health-wise.
We hope he recovers.
But if you think then about these two things being really front and center on the political agenda in the state, these are not the issues that by all signals the governor and Republican candidates really wanted to be talking about as they pivoted from the regular legislative session into the 2022 campaign session. Like a lot of national Republicans, but with a decidedly Texas twist. The governor leaned hard into immigration and border security in the immediate aftermath of the session with his announcement that he would be directing the construction of a new wall in Texas. Like many of us who direct things, he was going to hire a project. He's going to hire a project manager,
right?
More attention to policing and law and order, discussion of both the Texas economy and even while pointing to the Biden administration as being spendthrift and socialist and wrecking the national economy. The direction that the Republican political class in the state, led by the governor, wanted to move couldn't have been much more clear. And that is not what's going on right now, given the pandemic, but also given, the mess in the legislature where, we've got a game of chicken in which, while the Republican majority and the Republican governing governing party seems to have gone in this with substantial strategic and tactical advantages, it seems like they've wound up in a very intractable confrontation with Democrats.
Yeah, I think there were a lot of people asking, at the beginning of the Democratic exodus, like, what's the end game, what's the point? And my kind of thing has been, well, I think regardless of whether they can achieve anything or whether we end up, where the Republican Party wants at the end of this, regardless of what they do, they achieve the direction of the discussion. And so at least for a brief period, at least by Democrats being in Washington, the discussion became about voting rights. And you can see if Republicans in the state have made, I would say multiple efforts from my view of things, have made multiple efforts to try to shift the conversation in a different direction, whether that's on the voting legislation in particular and trying to cast it as a bill that would expand voting access as opposed to what Democrats have said about it. Or, again, to even shift the conversation, towards immigration or other issues where they feel comfortable on. The problem is, for them at least, is, one, they've been unsuccessful really at shifting the discussion around the voting rights legislation. And part of that is, state media, national media, and I think the Democrats still not being here. Two, COVID, the COVID resurgence, is just, it brings up the quality of government services so directly.
And governance in a state in which one party indisputably owns governance.
Well, and that's the thing. That's the other piece of this. So, and this is the thing that you and I were talking about, which is, in a state in which one party indisputably owns governance, there's sort of a question that comes up, which is, with every special session that gets called on these other issues that have nothing to do with COVID in particular, I would say, does it just start to look like you're ineffectual? And to everybody, one of the things, I'd say definitely, there's a recursive feature to this, which is that, part of, we're saying that primary politics has been driving a lot of this. We've been talking about,
Republican primary politics.
Republican primary politics. And to the extent that, dissident, leaders on the right who claim to speak for, activated partisans have been criticizing the governor and legislative leaders for not being able to achieve 100% of their aims. Well, then we get a special session and they still can't achieve 100% of their aims. Does it really matter that it's because Democrats aren't here?
Yeah.
I don't really think it does to the dissidents because of, their ultimate goal is to gain power and and have their own control of the agenda. That's really the point here. But I would also say more generally at some point, doesn't it just start to look ineffective and ineffectual?
Yeah, and I think that, I think that, the politics of this are very complicated because I think it's probably still an okay short-term strategy going into the primaries, depending on how much longer this lasts.
Not an unimportant consideration.
But not irrelevant. And certainly, I think changes the calculation that was shaping Republicans' orientation up until, up to this point, really, which was that they really didn't have to worry about the general election very much. Now, they may still not have to, given that there's still no Democratic gubernatorial candidate.
It's still a midterm election with a Democrat president in the White House.
It's not as if the whole terrain has shifted, but it's introduced a lot more uncertainty into this environment, I think. Now, speaking of uncertainty, to be fair, there have been some interesting things going on the Democratic side since the second session was called, and some fraction. It sounds like I've seen different numbers. About half of Democrats are no longer in DC, or that were in DC, or
they're unaccounted for.
Yeah, there's some 20 something there, and all this noise about a couple that went through on a planned vacation to Europe. Apparently, all these things. But I think the thing I really noticed was something that looked remarkably like the national Democrats when, you had a few Democrats show up on the House floor on Monday, and you had other Democrats from the progressive wing of the party showing up on Twitter and name checking and criticizing them as showing up to essentially, I think this is a paraphrase, but, to help, to more or less, quote unquote, help Republicans carry out their voter suppression agenda, unquote.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, while we've seen grumbling and from the very beginning, we expected there to be some tension among Democrats. After all, it's a collective action problem to keep everybody on the same page on the quorum break and leaving town and all this. But it was an outbreak of real open criticism and of some Democrats that are not unpopular in the caucus. Joe Moody, who had been pro tem, Mary Gonzalez from El Paso. Now, these are both Democrats who are perhaps, closer to the Republican speaker and to the Republican leadership in the House than, say, the farther, the more progressive Democrats who are issuing some of this criticism, including Gina Hinojosa from Austin. I can't remember honestly the other person I saw. But then this morning, as we were getting ready to record this, we had a coalition of progressive groups in Texas, including Planned Parenthood, Progress Texas, a few others that are active players in Democratic politics, also come out and essentially issue the same kind of criticism and urge Democrats to keep up the quorum break in order, to not only stop the election legislation that, triggered this ostensibly, but also the other items that, are very anathema to progressives that are on the governor's agenda, like, restricting, transgender athletes in their participation in sports.
Further abortion legislation. Looks like sort of an attempt to limit paid sick leave.
I hate to utter the words critical race theory, but the, limiting curriculum on racism in public schools. So it's an interesting development that I think, kind of raises the temperature on something where the temperature was already pretty high.
Yeah, I mean, if you strip the labels for a second and just, instead of thinking about Democrats and Republicans and just sort of think about, aligning members, along some sort of a spectrum in terms of, who has, play and cachet in the process and who doesn't. Right. And some of that is obviously going to be, a lot of that's going to be directed by partisanship. Ultimately, most Republicans are going to have more say than most Democrats, but not all Republicans are going to have more play in the process than all Democrats.
Right.
And so ultimately, when you kind of look at that and you think about, Democrats in Texas and, again, Republicans control the process, there are Democrats who have done a good job representing their districts by having close ties with Republican legislators and being given in some cases, positions of power and authority that honestly the progressive Democrats who are, throwing the stones in this case have not had and never will.
Right.
In a context in which, if you're thinking about, I always call this, it's very social, a repeated game, right? Each session is a game. So this is one game, but it's going to happen again. So when you play a repeated game, you have to think about how you play this time because it affects next time. And if you think about the people, who might be making their way back, part of it is, these are people who maybe have more to lose going into next time than the people who may look at this last session and say, what more could I lose?
Yeah, I think that's, I think that's a reasonable, top level read of that. Yeah.
And then I just also say the other piece of this too is, again, nobody wants to live in a hotel for 2 months, and especially nobody wants to live in a hotel in Washington, D.C. in the summer for 2 months. Right. And every Democrat who leaves basically puts more pressure on the Democrats who are there not to be the next one, not to be the one who goes back and then provides a quorum. And so,
and that's been a fact of this from the beginning. We talked about this, I think, when this started, that, there's a very human dimension to this in terms of figuring out people's behavior. So I think the last thing I want to point out here before we sign off is, that this is continuing to radiate throughout the political process as, you saw this fight inside the legislature. The governor got involved in an explicitly, war between the branches piece with his defunding of with his vetoing of the funding article, which effectively threatened to defund the legislature over the next biennium. And now the courts are getting involved as both the members of the legislative and the executive branch are going into the state courts and suing for relief. And now, different levels of courts. There were some Democrats had early success in staying warrants against the quorum busting members, the civil warrants that had been issued by the speaker. I think as of this morning or last night, the Texas Supreme Court had weighed in and issued a stay on that lower court. So, just as we exit for today, I do want to point out this is now. This fire has now spread across all three branches of Texas government, even as the fight over COVID is a fight between state government in many ways, and increasingly a fight between state and local government. It's been that from the beginning, but that is really reaching a critical point. So what we're seeing now is a Texas political system that is just incredibly conflict-ridden at this moment. Not just between Democrats and Republicans, but that fight taking place across virtually the entire spectrum of Texas government, from, across the branches and from the state level down to school districts, cities, counties. So with that, I want to thank Josh for being here. We will thank our crew in the Liberal Arts Development Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin, which I know is working hard right now amidst a lot of uncertainty at the university caused once again by the Delta variant. And thanks to you for listening, and be back next week with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.